Professor Klaxon adjusted his 4 pairs of spectacles with the precision of a surgeon and the irritation of someone who had clearly chosen the wrong career path. The Zentorian's pale blue skin had developed a nervous twitch somewhere around his third eye, which was currently focused on the one student who made every lecture feel like a descent into academic madness. "Class," Klaxon began, his voice carrying the exhausted tone of someone who had given up on life somewhere around tenure. "Before we begin today's lesson on Class 5 predatory organisms, I feel compelled to remind you that xenobiology is a science of observation, not interaction." He shot a pointed look at Jake Murphy, the lone human in Advanced Xenobiology 101, who was currently doodling what appeared to be a stick figure riding some sort of tentacled beast. Jake looked up with the innocent expression of someone who had definitely not been caught planning interspecies friendship activities during lecture time. "Oh, come on, Professor K," Jake said, because apparently 3 months at the Galactic Academy had given him the confidence to nickname faculty members. "You say interaction like it's a bad thing. What's the worst that could happen?" The collective intake of breath from his classmates could have powered a small starship. Pip, a nervous Quillian whose feathers were permanently ruffled from chronic anxiety, made a sound somewhere between a squeak and a sob. Thorax, the methodical insectoid from Hive Prime, began clicking disapprovingly in binary. Even Glub, the aquatic cetacean who communicated through bioluminescent patterns, flashed a very clear, "This human will be the death of us all" display. "The worst that could happen," Klaxon said with the patience of someone explaining fire safety to a pyromaniac, "is that you end up as a footnote in someone else's survival guide." Again. This was, unfortunately, not Jake's first mention in academic literature. His previous encounters with harmless fauna had resulted in what the medical bay now referred to as Murphy incidents. There was the time he had befriended a pack of acid-spitting Zephyrian wolves, the incident with the supposedly extinct lava salamanders on Volcanic Station 7, and who could forget the great mushroom uprising of Spore Colony Beta, which had started when Jake decided that the local fungal intelligence just needed a good hug and some understanding. "Besides," Jake continued, completely ignoring the fact that 3 different species were now praying to their respective deities for his continued survival, "you academics always make everything sound scarier than it actually is. I'd bet half these so-called deadly predators just need proper socialization." Professor Klaxon's twitch intensified. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he wondered if early retirement was still an option, or maybe a career change. Sanitation engineering was looking pretty appealing right about now. "Today," he said, gripping his lecture pointer with enough force to bend metal, "we will be discussing the most dangerous predator in the known galaxy, the Void Stalker of Kepler 442b. And Mr. Murphy, if you so much as think about approaching one of these creatures, I will personally recommend you for remedial common sense training." Jake's eyes lit up with the kind of enthusiasm that made insurance companies weep and safety inspectors resign on the spot. "Void Stalker," he said, already reaching for his notebook. "Cool name. Do they respond to belly rubs?" Professor Klaxon's eye twitches had synchronized into a rhythm that could probably power a small percussion ensemble. He activated the holographic display with the resignation of someone about to explain why jumping into an active volcano was inadvisable. "The Void Stalker," he began, his voice taking on the tone of a funeral director, "is not your friend, Mr. Murphy. It is not anyone's friend. Friendship is a concept as foreign to this creature as common sense appears to be to certain members of this class." The hologram flickered to life, displaying what could only be described as if someone had taken a panther, fed it pure nightmare fuel, and then asked it to participate in a horror movie audition. The creature was roughly the size of a small shuttle, covered in what appeared to be living shadow that moved independently of any light source. Its eyes were twin voids that seemed to absorb photons just for the fun of it. "Note the acidic saliva," Klaxon continued, highlighting the creature's mouth as it drooled something that made the ground smoke and bubble. "AFH level of -3. It can dissolve through titanium steel composites in under 4 minutes. "Ooh," Jake said, raising his hand again. "Does that mean it has sensitive teeth? Maybe it needs special dental care." Pip made a noise that sounded like a tea kettle having an existential crisis. Thorax began calculating probability matrices for Jake's survival, which appeared to be approaching absolute zero. Glub's bioluminescent patches were flashing what roughly translated to, "Why did I choose this elective?" Furthermore, Klaxon pressed on, ignoring Jake's dental concerns, the Void Stalker possesses telepathic hunting capabilities. It can read the fear responses of its prey from up to 12 kilometers away. So it's basically an empath, Jake nodded sagely. That's actually pretty sweet. I bet it just needs someone who isn't afraid of it. Mr. Murphy, Claxon's voice cracked like a whip. This creature has a documented kill rate of 100%. 100%. Do you understand what that means? It means nobody's tried the right approach yet, Jake said, with the confidence of someone who had clearly never met a creature he couldn't befriend. What's its pack structure like? Alpha dynamics? Do they play? Professor Claxon stared at his human student with the expression of someone watching their entire worldview crumble in real time. The creature on the hologram seemed to sense his distress and let out a roar that made the speakers crackle, and several students questioned their life choices. Damien don't play D'Americo, Mr. Murphy. They hunt, they kill, they consume. The last research team sent to study them left behind only their boots and a partially digested recorder with 17 minutes of screaming. Right, but did anyone try talking to them first? Jake asked, completely missing the point with surgical precision. Maybe they were just scared. Big predators are usually just misunderstood softies, once you get past the whole murder thing. Thorax stopped calculating and started praying. Pip had begun molting from stress. Even Glub had turned a color that didn't exist in any known spectrum, which was generally considered a bad sign among aquatic species. Professor Claxon closed his eyes and wondered if it was too late to transfer to a nice, safe department, like theoretical physics or explosive ordnance disposal. The silence that followed Jake's question about talking to them first stretched long enough for several civilizations to rise and fall. Professor Claxon opened his eyes slowly, like someone emerging from a coma to discover their house had been converted into a daycare center for particularly destructive toddlers. Which brings me, he said with the enthusiasm of someone announcing their own execution, to this semester's mandatory field research component. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Pip's feathers began shedding at an alarming rate, creating what looked like a small blizzard around her desk. Thorax's compound eyes dilated in what could only be described as insectoid horror. Glub turned a shade of purple that marine biologists would later classify as impending doom. We will be conducting observational research, Claxon continued, emphasizing the word observational like it was a sacred incantation. On Kepler 442b, the homeworld of the Voidstalker. Jake's hand shot up so fast it created a small sonic boom. Can we pet them? No. Feed them? Absolutely not. What about just a little boop on the nose? Professor Claxon's eye twitch had evolved into what medical professionals might classify as a small seizure. Mr. Murphy, I have here a 47-page safety protocol that explicitly forbids any and all interaction with indigenous fauna. This includes but is not limited to touching, feeding, naming, photographing with, speaking to, singing at, dancing near, or making what humans apparently call kissy faces at any creature larger than a microbe. 47 pages seems excessive, Jake said thoughtfully. Did someone really try singing at dangerous aliens before? The collective silence from his classmates answered that question more effectively than words ever could. Furthermore, Claxon continued, desperately trying to maintain some semblance of academic authority, you will be accompanied by Security Chief Vorthon, whom you may know by his nickname. Which is? Jake asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer wouldn't be Cuddles. Captain Buzzkill, Claxon said with grim satisfaction. Chief Vorthon earned this title through his remarkable ability to eliminate anything that moves, breathes, or exists in a potentially threatening manner. His personal weapons arsenal includes enough firepower to sterilize a small moon, and his standing orders regarding Class 5 predators are, quote, shoot first, shoot second, and if there's anything left, shoot it again for good measure. Pip had begun making a sound like a deflating balloon. Thorax was calculating the statistical probability of survival, which appeared to be hovering somewhere between highly unlikely and mathematically impossible. Glub had turned completely transparent, which, among cetaceans, was the equivalent of playing dead. Jake, however, looked positively delighted. So we get to meet Captain Buzzkill and the Voidstalkers, he said, as if Claxon had just announced they'd won a vacation to the happiest place in the galaxy. This is going to be the best field trip ever. Professor Claxon stared at his human student and wondered, not for the first time, if the Galactic Academy's diversity initiative had gone too far. Somewhere in the distance, what sounded suspiciously like ominous thunder rumbled across the station, though the weather control system insisted conditions were perfectly clear. Class dismissed, Claxon said weakly. Please update your emergency contact information. And your wills. 3 days later, the research vessel Academic Integrity touched down on Kepler 442b with all the grace of a brick falling through wet cement. The planet's surface was exactly as advertised in the tourism brochures that didn't exist because no sane species would vacation here: rocky, desolate, and possessed of an atmosphere that seemed to whisper abandon hope in 17 different languages. Captain Buzzkill, whose real name was Security Chief Vorthan, but who had earned his nickname through a combination of excessive firepower and a personality that could suck the joy out of a birthday party, emerged from the ship wearing enough weaponry to outfit a small army. His scales were a dull gray that matched his worldview, and his expression suggested he was already planning funeral arrangements for the entire research team. "Listen up, academics," Vortan growled, his voice like gravel in a blender. "The research station is exactly 47 meters that way. You will walk in single file. You will not deviate from the marked path. You will not touch anything, smell anything, or look directly at anything for longer than 3 seconds. Any questions?" Jake raised his hand. "What if something wants to touch us?" Gordon's response was to chamber a round in his plasma rifle, with a sound that roughly translated to, "Try me." The research station was a marvel of paranoid engineering. Titanium walls thick enough to stop a freight train, automated defense turrets that tracked movement with the dedication of stalkers, and enough warning signs to paper a small apartment. The airlock alone required 17 different biometric scans, and what appeared to be a psychological evaluation. "Home sweet home," Professor Claxon muttered, as they sealed themselves inside what was essentially a very expensive coffin with scientific equipment. That's when they heard it. Scratch, scratch, scratch. "Did anyone else hear that?" Pip whispered, her feathers now falling out in clumps that could be used to stuff pillows. Thorax tilted his head, antennae twitching. "Affirmative. Something is attempting to breach the outer perimeter." Scratch, scratch, thump. "Oh, that's probably just Shadow," Jake said casually, not looking up from where he was unpacking what appeared to be a suspiciously large bag of treats. "He gets antsy when I'm away too long." The silence that followed was so profound it could have been bottled and sold as a meditation aid. "Shadow?" Professor Claxon's voice had climbed several octaves into what could charitably be called a shriek. "Yeah, my roommate," Jake said, as if this explained everything. "I found him on day 1 when I went for a walk. Poor guy was probably lonely. You know how it is when you're the only predator on the whole planet." Captain Buzzkill's weapon systems had begun charging with a high-pitched whine that suggested imminent violence. "Murphy, please tell me you did not just admit to harboring a Class 5 predator." "Oh, he's not Class 5 anymore," Jake said helpfully. "I'd say he's more of a Class Cuddly. Watch this." Jake walked to the airlock and pressed the intercom button. "Shadow, come here, boy. Who's a good cosmic whore? You are. Yes, you are." The scratching stopped. Then came a sound that was part purr, part nuclear reactor cooling down, and part the dying whispers of ancient gods. It was immediately followed by what could only be described as the galaxy's most enthusiastic tail-wagging, if tail-wagging could shake a reinforced research station like a maraca. "Sweet merciful void," Glub flashed in patterns that probably violated several interspecies communications treaties. The airlock began cycling. Captain Buzzkill raised his rifle. Professor Claxon began hyperventilating in 3 different breathing rhythms simultaneously. The automated defense system started targeting something that their sensors insisted was both there and not there, which caused them to enter what could technically be called an existential crisis loop. And then the inner door opened. What emerged was definitely a Void Stalker. It had all the standard features: reality-bending shadow flesh, eyes like portable black holes, claws that could probably carve through the space-time continuum if they felt like it. But there was something different about this particular cosmic nightmare. It was wearing a collar. Not just any collar, but what appeared to be a masterwork of engineering, cobbled together from spare ship parts, sensor equipment, and what looked suspiciously like a friendship bracelet made from plasma conduit wiring. A small tag dangled from it that read Shadow in Jake's distinctly human handwriting, with a little heart drawn underneath. The Void Stalker looked around the room, took in the sight of Captain Buzzkill's weapons trained on it, the terrified alien students, and Professor Claxon's academic breakdown in progress. Then it did something that violated approximately 14 different scientific papers on Void Stalker behavior. It wagged. Its entire back half wiggled with the enthusiasm of a creature that had found its favorite humans and wanted everyone to know about it. The shadow stuff that comprised its body rippled in waves of what could only be described as cosmic happiness. "Shadow, sit," Jake said calmly. The creature that had a documented 100% kill rate sat. Its tail, which was made of concentrated darkness and existential dread, thumped against the floor with the enthusiasm of a hyperactive puppy. "Good boy," Jake said, producing what appeared to be a treat from his pocket. "Who wants a snack?" The Void Stalker's response was to make a sound like a freight train learning to purr, while Professor Klaxon made a sound like a tea kettle learning to scream. Captain Buzzkill's reaction was immediate and predictable. His plasma rifle whined to full charge as he shouted, "Hostile contact! Engaging threat!" "Whoa there, Captain Shooty," Jake said, stepping between the weapon and Shadow with the casual confidence of someone who had clearly never read a safety manual in his life. "He's not hostile. Show him, Shadow. Shake." The Void Stalker, this creature of pure nightmare that had terrorized 3 star systems and appeared in the fever dreams of seasoned space marines, lifted one massive paw that was comprised of what appeared to be crystallized darkness and cosmic horror, and shook hands with Jake. Captain Buzzkill's rifle made a confused beeping sound as its targeting systems tried to process what they were seeing. The weapon's AI had apparently entered the same existential crisis loop as the station's defense systems. "This is impossible," Professor Klaxon whispered, his 4 eyes blinking in sequence like a malfunctioning traffic light. "The literature clearly states that Void Stalkers are incapable of domestication. They lack the neural pathways for pack bonding. They don't even have emotions." "That's what I thought too," Jake said, scratching behind Shadow's ears, which was apparently a location that existed somewhere in the writhing mass of cosmic terror. The creature leaned into the scratches with an expression of bliss that somehow managed to be visible despite having a face made of living void. "But it turns out your literature was written by people who never actually tried being nice to them." "Being nice?" Thorax clicked in disbelief. "You domesticated a Class 5 predator by being nice to it?" "Well, that and snacks," Jake admitted. "Turns out Shadow here has a real weakness for military rations. Specifically the beef stew. Who knew cosmic horrors were foodies?" Shadow's tail wagged harder at the mention of beef stew, creating what could only be described as a localized reality distortion field. Several instruments began giving readings that violated the laws of physics, which was generally considered Tuesday behavior around Jake. "Stand down immediately," Captain Buzzkill roared, though his rifle was now pointing at the ceiling in confusion. "That creature is a registered galactic threat." Shadow turned to look at the captain and tilted its head in what was unmistakably the universal gesture for, "Did someone say something?" The movement caused its collar to jingle, a sound that somehow managed to be both adorable and cosmically terrifying. "Now you've hurt his feelings," Jake said reproachfully. "Shadow's very sensitive about the whole galactic threat thing. Aren't you, buddy?" The Void Stalker responded by doing something that caused Professor Klaxon to start hyperventilating again. It rolled over and exposed what appeared to be a belly made of swirling nebulae and concentrated starlight. "Oh, for the love of all that's scientific," Jake said, kneeling down to provide the requested belly rubs. "Look at this. Classic submissive behavior. He trusts me completely." "This violates everything we know about xenobiology," Klaxon muttered, frantically taking notes despite his obvious mental breakdown. "Void Stalkers don't have social hierarchies. They don't form attachments. They certainly don't engage in recreational physical contact." "Maybe they just needed the right teacher," Jake said as Shadow made happy rumbling sounds that were causing minor seismic activity. "I used the Henderson method." "The Henderson method?" Thorax queried, his scientific curiosity temporarily overriding his survival instincts. "Treat everything like it's a dog until proven otherwise," Jake explained cheerfully. "Works about 90% of the time. The other 10% usually involves running really fast." Captain Buzzkill lowered his weapon slightly, though he kept it at ready position. "You're telling me you turned the galaxy's most feared predator into a pet using dog training techniques?" "Hey, if it works, it works," Jake shrugged. "Shadow here just needed some structure in his life. A regular feeding schedule, plenty of exercise, and someone who wasn't constantly screaming and shooting at him. Amazing what a little positive reinforcement can accomplish." Shadow, as if understanding the conversation, stood up and moved to sit next to Jake with the dignified posture of a creature that had found its proper place in the universe. The sight of a cosmic horror sitting like a well-trained guard dog while wearing a homemade collar was so surreal that Pip actually stopped molting from shock. "This is going to require so much paperwork," Captain Buzzkill muttered, finally lowering his rifle completely. "The Galactic Threat Assessment Committee is going to want words. Long words, angry words. Look on the bright side, Jake said, giving Shadow another scratch behind the ears. You're probably the first security chief in galactic history to file a report about a successful diplomatic resolution with a Class 5 predator. Professor Claxon looked up from his frantic note-taking. Mr. Murphy, do you have any idea what you've accomplished here? Made a friend, Jake suggested. You've revolutionized our understanding of predator psychology, interspecies communication, and the fundamental nature of consciousness itself, Claxon said, his voice climbing toward hysteria again. This is the greatest xenobiological discovery in the history of the field. Cool, Jake said. Does this mean I get extra credit? 6 months later, the Galactic Academy had undergone what administrators diplomatically called significant curriculum restructuring, and what everyone else called the Murphy Revolution. The classroom that had once been Advanced Xenobiology 101 was now the home of Applied Xenobiology, also known as Pet Training for Apocalypse Beasts. The sterile academic environment had been replaced with something that looked like a cross between a veterinary clinic and a daycare center for cosmic horrors. Shadow lounged in the corner, wearing what appeared to be a new collar studded with actual stars that Jake had somehow convinced to stay put. The Voidstalker was currently serving as a living couch for 3 smaller creatures that shouldn't have existed in the same dimensional space. A acid-spitting Zephyrian wolf pup that Jake had named Sparky, a lava salamander called Hot Dog, and something that defied classification, but answered to princess tentacles. All right, class, Jake announced to his students, who included several seasoned xenobiologists, 2 retired military officers, and 1 very confused philosopher who had wandered into the wrong building. Today we're covering intermediate pack dynamics, with your Class 3 and above companions. Former Professor Claxon, now relegated to teaching assistant status after his complete academic breakdown, sat in the front row frantically taking notes. His nervous twitch had evolved into what could charitably be called interpretive dance, but his documentation of Jake's methods was thorough enough to revolutionize 3 different scientific fields. Remember, Jake continued, the key to successful interspecies bonding is confidence, consistency, and snacks. Always snacks. Princess Tentacles, stop trying to digest the homework assignments. The creature in question, which appeared to be a cross between an octopus and a black hole, sheepishly released what remained of a datapad and attempted to look innocent. This was difficult to accomplish when your face was a swirling vortex of cosmic energy, but Princess Tentacles gave it their best effort. Sir, called out Commander Blast, a former military officer whose previous career had involved eliminating exactly these types of creatures. What's your success rate with the domestication protocols? 100% so far, Jake said cheerfully. Though I'll admit the first few attempts were a bit touch and go. Sparky here tried to dissolve my leg before we worked out our communication issues. Sparky, the acid-spitting wolf pup, looked up from where he was chewing on what appeared to be a titanium squeaky toy, and wagged his tail with enough enthusiasm to melt a small crater in the floor. The secret is understanding that most aggressive behavior comes from fear or miscommunication, Jake explained, while Shadow demonstrated by gently picking up a terrified graduate student with his mouth and moving him to a safer location, away from Hot Dog's inadvertent lava drips. These creatures aren't evil, they're just misunderstood. And usually really, really hungry. What about the telepathic hunting abilities? Asked Dr. Finnegan, a xenopsychologist who had spent her entire career studying predator behavior and was currently questioning everything she thought she knew about the universe. Oh, that's the best part, Jake grinned. Shadow doesn't read fear anymore because there's nothing to be afraid of. Now he just picks up on emotions in general. He's actually better than most therapists. Shadow, how's Dr. Finnegan feeling today? The Voidstalker turned its cosmic gaze toward the doctor and made a sound like gentle wind chimes made of distant stars. Dr. Finnegan suddenly looked more relaxed than she had in years. Projected anxiety about career trajectory and unresolved issues with her mother, Jake translated helpfully. Shadow says she should call home more often and maybe try meditation. Dr. Finnegan stared at the cosmic horror that had just provided better psychological insight than her last 3 therapy sessions combined. This is impossible, she whispered. That's what everyone keeps saying, Jake said, reaching into his bag for more treats. But impossible is just another word for nobody tried it with enough snacks and patience. Former Professor Claxon raised his hand from the front row. Jake, sir, what's your next project? Jake's eyes lit up with the kind of enthusiasm that made insurance companies add new exclusions to their policies. Well, funny you should ask. I've been reading about these things called entropy devourers on the dark side of Proxima Centauri. Apparently they consume the life force of entire solar systems. The room fell silent, except for the sound of Princess Tentacles helpfully organizing the lesson plans and Shadow's contented purring. But get this, Jake continued, completely oblivious to the expressions of cosmic horror around him. According to the reports, nobody's ever tried offering them anything to eat besides, the screaming souls of the innocent. I'm thinking maybe they're just hangry. I mean, wouldn't you be cranky if you'd been subsisting on existential dread for a few million years? Shadow looked up at his human and made a sound that somehow conveyed both unconditional support and mild concern for Jake's continued survival. Then he gently picked up Jake's slippers in his mouth and brought them over, because apparently even cosmic horrors understood the importance of keeping their humans comfortable. The slippers, Jake's classmates couldn't help but notice, appeared to be made from the hide of something that looked suspiciously like a galactic threat level 7 creature that had been officially declared extinct. Same time next week, everyone, Jake announced cheerfully as class ended. And remember, the universe is full of friends you just haven't met yet. Some of them just happen to have more teeth and existential dread than others. As the students filed out, stepping carefully around creatures that could theoretically unmake reality itself but were currently more interested in belly rubs and treats, former Professor Claxon approached Jake with the expression of someone who had witnessed the impossible so many times it was starting to feel normal. "Jake," he said quietly, "do you ever worry that maybe, just maybe, one of these creatures might actually be dangerous?" Jake looked around the room at his collection of domesticated apocalypse beasts, all of whom were currently engaged in activities that ranged from adorable to adorably terrifying. Shadow was helping Princess Tentacles with what appeared to be a crossword puzzle, while Sparky and Hot Dog played a game that involved melting and resilifying the same metal toy. "Nah," Jake said with a grin that had become legendary throughout the galaxy for its ability to make risk assessment specialists weep. "They're all good boys. Even Princess Tentacles, and she's technically genderless." And somewhere in the distance, on the dark side of Proxima Centauri, something that fed on the death of stars sneezed and wondered why it suddenly felt like someone was planning to offer it snacks.